Bernie Sanders was never going to be the candidate, never will be. It's ironic, isn't it? The Republican Party had a far more small d democratic process. They hated Trump, but he won the vote and they let him win it. Whereas the Democrats would not do that for Sanders, right? So that's the scary part. The Republican Party was actually more open to somebody who was challenging them than the Democrats would ever. And that's frightening. And I'm old enough to remember the Jesse Jackson campaign, and Jerry Brown ran, and Tom Harkin, and all these people who were like supposed to be like, kind of reformed lefties. And the Democrats crushed every one of them. And one more thing, I'm sorry, but as we talked about third parties, another problem there is that when you lose, and you will, you're going to get blamed. And one of the biggest things I've said since Ralph Nader in 2000 is, if you're going to run and the Democrats blame you, then you should embrace that. Instead of saying, no, we didn't defeat you, it was this and this and this. To me, what Nader should have said, and what other people, or Jill Stein, whoever should say, is, you're damn right we beat you. You lost because of us, and it'll continue that way unless you start listening to what these people want.
Before we get to the video, please like, comment, subscribe, share it to that uncle who's a communist. And if he isn't, he will be.
Don't forget to follow us on Patreon at patreon.com/revolutionaryrhetoric. And Revolutionary Rhetoric is an affiliate of the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network.
All right, let's get to the video. All right. Thank you for coming onto our podcast. We have Green and Red. Is it so? It's just Green and Red podcast? Is that how it's pronounced?
Yep.
Nice. I assume, Bob, you're the red, and Scott, you're the green?
Kind of the way it works out, yeah.
That's very nice.
But Bob's a little green, and I'm a little red, too. Yeah, I'm a little black and red,
It's a Christmas podcast.
Yeah, after we started it, we thought of that,
I know, it's nice. It's catchy. It's very simple.
Well, the first, if you've seen our logo, it's a fist that's green and red.
Yeah.
But the first logo our designer made was actually a star with green and red, and we were like, that looks like a Christmas tree. Yeah. And so we we nixed that.
Oh my God. Well, fair enough. You really gotta make sure that, the logo that's representing your podcast is ideal and doesn't have any like weird backdraws like, Christmas podcast. Alrighty. Well, thank you for coming on. We're glad to have you on. You are our very first guest from the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network. We have yet to have 805 and Dystopian Grift. But it's been fun so far since we've been part of it. And we want to get the other guys coming on as well and have like a round table with everybody. That would be kind of ideal because as I know, everybody here has a little bit different of political views, a little bit of variation of anti-capitalism. And I want to start off by just asking, what would you define your actual anti-capitalist views as?
Yeah, I probably fall more in that like anarcho-syndicalism. I have a long history of doing like anarchist direct action. I come out of like Earth First and Rising Tide and a lot of anarchist horizontal organizing, and then have been part of movements for 25 years, whether it's resisting corporate globalization or wars or environmental destruction and climate disaster and things like that. And definitely view myself as a anarchist and anarcho-syndicalist.
Got it. What about you, Bob?
Well, I'm a professor now, so I'm kind of the stereotypical academic lefty, but I was raised in a union family in Ohio where almost everybody in my family was actually union presidents. So I kind of came out of that kind of older tradition, and then, over the years kind of gravitated more toward kind of more socialist ideas. And in the last 10 years, I've become far more open to the kind of stuff Scott's talking to me about, the anarchist. But, it tends to be an anti-capitalist, traditional kind of a more older left, I would say, than a new, well, not new left, 60s left, but kind of not a contemporary left as much as kind of a little bit of an older one. And Scott and I met in Houston doing a lot of like anti-globalization work, and then in the early 2000s, anti-war work. So we started on that, and then he moved more into the environmental realm, and I still do whatever. I've always done a lot of media, and then we started the podcast, early 2000. So
2020, not 2020.
well, 2020. I always forget
We
that.
probably have more followers if we started in 2000.
Yeah, superstars now, but yeah, I keep those. But and so I think we're still active in these things. Like he does obviously way more than I do, but I'm like more kind of media centric, and we have the podcast, but then I also get interviewed quite a bit, about especially things like foreign affairs and wars and stuff like that.
Got it. And from what I've read, you've been like a guest speaker at different universities as well.
Yeah, I've spoken many places. It's kind of cool. Yeah, even
Yeah.
Oxford. Actually, Oxford,
Ooh.
very cool. Yeah.
Nice. Are these like political, or more historic? Like,
Well, they're probably, if you saw it like on my CV, they're probably more historical. But like everything I do is both. Like I don't really kind of separate them or compartmentalize them. So, if even if it's an academic conference, they're going to get a good dose of what I believe in, and I'm going to somehow bring Marx or whoever, anti-imperialism, whatever into it.
got it.
But I actually do a lot of public speaking as well in media and things like that.
Yeah, I was reading a little bit about you guys on your website, which is beautifully created, by the way. We don't have a website ourselves yet, but we're thinking about it. We figured, with Instagram and everything, it should be enough, but it kind of looks a lot more official to have a website. So you guys said you've been part of like many different types of organizations and etc. And you said, I've read something about Houston Global Awareness Collective. What is that?
So the background is Bob. I was Bob's graduate student, and then, the movement. There was a lot of movement activity at the time. The WTO protests, and then anti-corporate globalization movement, and so we started doing the organizing together. We started doing it with a bunch of our friends, basically like our friends and people who were other students at University of Houston, but, just people from the sort of progressive and radical community in Houston, which you wouldn't think because it's Texas, but, inner city Houston actually still does have a pretty big sort of progressive, liberal, radical sort of base. And so we formed Houston Global Awareness Collective to do organizing in the lead up to what were going to be some pretty big protests around the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in September 2011. We actually had a group probably of like 40 people.
2001.
2001.
You got the year wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all blending together. But we did this, in the lead up to what were going to be these pretty big protests in September of 2001. We spent that whole summer building up. We had a huge crew. We did all these teach-ins all over Houston. We raised money because we were going to go to DC and participate in what felt like the revolution. And then, 23 years ago today, 9/11 happens, and it sort of like derailed a lot of what was going on. And then Houston Global Awareness Collective, we continued to do anti-globalization stuff, but then it shifted much more into like an anti-war group. And then in Houston, because it's so many energy companies and there were a lot of war profiteers that are based there, we actually we brought about I would actually say a global justice analysis to like some of the anti-war work. And we targeted Halliburton and this company that was a subsidiary of it at the time called KBR, Kellogg Brown and Root, and did a lot of political education around that, did a lot of protest and direct action and stuff like that.
Yeah, oil companies. It was before the war in 2003. We had vigils for like 6 weeks prior to the war breaking out in March, and at Halliburton downtown. Really got a great response. It was the coolest thing I'd seen in Houston, anytime up to that point. We hit people coming out of all the corporate headquarters, the oil companies, and Continental at the time, and Halliburton, and
Enron was down there.
Enron was down there. That's right. We covered the Enron crash, So, yeah, we actually got a really good response, basically pointing out that look at all these contracts that Halliburton is getting. They're getting billions of dollars in contracts because of Dick Cheney, and they're going to go in and destroy a country for profit. And that really resonated with people who you would never consider even liberal, let alone, leftists.
Yeah.
So it was pretty cool. And, this is often the case if you study U.S. history. Like, people will be involved in making progress, and then some other crisis will emerge. Like the Vietnam War really kind of put a monkey wrench into a lot of other movements that were occurring in the 60s. And in the same way, we kind of pivoted to do this anti-war work, and so the globalization stuff we were doing kind of took on a peripheral role. And unfortunately,
I would say we did a good job of sort of merging the two. I don't think that
Oh,
happened as effectively in other parts of the country or the
Yeah.
world.
yeah, we did. We continued to do a lot of well, there was a CAFTA meeting in
Mhm.
Houston.
Mhm.
And so we had a great, action there, stuff like that. But yeah, it was difficult. But Houston is great. It's symbolically, it's perfect, right? Because like the energy capital of the world and all these corporations and banks and
Where the Bushes were
Texans,
from.
Bush and Cheney and Jim Baker and everybody. So it was great. We I think kind of capitalized on it in some really cool ways.
Got it. And then, like, from the 20 plus years you guys have been, conducting these protests and going through these organizations, do you see any actual improvement? Like realistically, with how much power, these companies have. I know in the moment it feels really revolutionary, but over a longer period of time, did you see a greater effect? At least in the Houston area, there must have been like a lot more influence and a lot more objection to these companies in general.
I mean, I try to be hopeful and optimistic, but it's not easy. I think in the moment we thought we were doing something, and we really did get a lot of response from people who otherwise wouldn't have. But you look at Scott and I were talking earlier today. Look at the debate last night when you had both candidates embracing these same values and these same political ideas. There are clearly nuances there, but so it's kind of hard in retrospect to look back. When you have Trump and Harris, who are both arguably more conservative than like Reagan and Bush were, or Clinton and Obama were. So it's kind of hard. I mean, I think it's important to do it, and if anything, and I'm sure Scott's had this experience with younger activists. Like as a professor, like I hear a lot of students come in and say, like just the other day, students came in and told me how important this class was, how important it was for me to talk about interventions and the U.S. military and wars and all that kind of stuff. So I'd say that was the kind of I've taught probably 50 to 60,000 students in my career, and so that's kind of cool that you kind of got through to some of them. But
Yeah.
in terms of changing America, I'm not that arrogant to think that because we've gone through a moment like Occupy Wall Street was a heady moment, and we've had stuff like that happen, but it's just so, as you know, right? It's so hard to sustain that.
Yeah, the other thing, Bob and I did a show today that's actually talked about the debates, even though don't think it was our intention, but we just can't help
Yeah, I
ourselves.
was listening to that earlier actually.
Or no, we haven't even posted that one yet.
Oh, okay. I've
Yeah.
heard the one on 9/11 that you posted
Oh,
earlier today.
Cool. Yeah,
that's from 4 years ago.
Oh,
That was just
okay.
that was an encore episode, but we did one today that's actually on the ruling class, how elites are supporting Kamala Harris, especially traditional elites supporting Kamala Harris over Trump, but we obviously talked about the debate a lot, and
It's where
protecting the dogs and the cats in Ohio, and all that sort of stuff. But my point is that we were talking actually about how institutions, particularly governmental institutions, have actually become more conservative and move further to the right. But the people are still very much. I actually feel like there's a lot of progressive attitudes in the U.S. as far as a lot of the issues. In 2020, when they burnt down I think it was the 5th precinct in Minneapolis, over 50% of Americans actually agreed with the people burning down a police precinct. More recent polls show that majority of Americans, 60-70% or more, actually support a ceasefire in Gaza and U.S. cutting off weapons to Israel and things like that. It's institutions that have moved more to the right. And sadly, institutions on the left have actually been, degraded by neoliberalism and been degraded by, just the institutions becoming more right-wing. Labor is actually a really good example of that. We're seeing a resurgence of labor, and that's very exciting. But and I do think that there's moments where we see the climate justice movements having some power, or we see this anti-genocide pro-Palestine movement having some power. But it's without institutions or more lasting organizations, it feels less lasting, if you know what I mean.
Got it. Yeah. What would you consider that there would
and
be
I think that's a loss, and that's why I think that the power holders and the far right have been able to make so many gains in the last 50 years.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. But would you say that there is any like relative difference between like the neoliberal and the neoconservative governments recently for the past 20 years in like and with like I don't know environmental issues or even like military issues? I know Joe Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, but a lot of Democratic senators or congressmen, they don't agree with him that he did that. And then recently, as you know, in like the debates, Kamala Harris said that she agreed with Joe Biden pulling out of Afghanistan. Do you see that as any progress with like anti-imperialism, or is that just the liberals, the Democrats, just putting on a show to get some progressives over?
I think Afghanistan was mostly a case of just cutting your losses because it was such a dismal and unwinnable situation. And it's something actually I agree with. It's probably the best thing Biden did. I think, Obama opening up to Cuba
Correct.
was probably the best thing he did, right?
Yeah.
But in general, neoliberalism, which I've actually studied quite a bit, is fairly pernicious and in many ways a more effective form of coercion and control than just, outright hostility. They do it through the marketplace and, through all this. It started with Jimmy Carter, who, I always say, like, Jimmy Carter as in post-presidential career was out inspirational. But as president, he was, a neoliberal and a war criminal. And so it's really hard. You think about what Clinton did, what Obama did, and the distinctions. They're the personal distinctions, the way they carried themselves, and the way they talked, and all that. But they're the corruption or whatever. Not quite at the Trump level. But in terms of what they actually did, Clinton gutted welfare, instituted the crime bill, which led to like mass incarceration.
Introduced into the Senate by Joe Biden.
Introduced into the Senate by Joe Biden. Obama, after the 2008-9 housing crash, took care of, the banks with TARP, and then the people who actually lost their homes, I think something like 1/10 of them got any kind of government remediation at all. So that's the problem. But, liberals are into this kind of vote blue no matter who.
Yeah, even like Obamacare was, an old heritage foundation
right.
plan.
It's amazing, isn't it? How
you
can attack it for being socialized medicine. There's nothing at all socialized in it. It's a gift to the private insurance companies and the private medical establishments, right? Yeah, exactly. That's a great example. And so I don't know. I'm not saying they're exactly alike, and I think that's kind of a very simplistic way of looking at it. They're exactly alike. They're not. There are differences on things like education funding and some other stuff. But, if you look at big issues like COVID or global warming or the surveillance state or Gaza and Ukraine, I mean, they're two halves of the same coin.
Yeah. Well, Scott, what do you think about like environmentally specifically? What do you think there are any actual real gains with the Democratic Party with like their actual policies pushing toward like more clean energy, or is that just a sham?
I mean, definitely what was called the Inflation Reduction Act did a lot to push to create more clean energy industry, but also there's a lot of subsidies for nuclear in that and carbon capture and storage, and there's a lot of sort of goodies in there for the fossil fuel sector. It allows them to drill for oil and gas and coal on public lands and things like that. And so, the Democrats probably don't take as much money from oil and gas and fossil fuels as the Republicans, but they don't take nothing either. Some friends of mine actually at the Democratic National Convention disrupted Exxon's side event at the DNC because they were there having a party for the Democrats. And I'm sure if you went and looked at how much money Exxon gives to each party, I'm sure there's a good amount of money that's going to the Democrats.
Did
I would say
more in 2016.
I
think Hillary got more oil money than Trump in 2016.
Wouldn't surprise me. Hillary's definitely an industry shill, right?
Yeah.
But Trump was also new at that point. I'm sure by the time 2020 rolled around, they were full behind him as well.
Yeah, oil may have been, but even then, Biden got a ton of, like Wall Street especially, money, ton of corporate money. Yeah.
I'll say one difference between the Democrats is they actually acknowledge that climate change is real, which is Trump just thinks it's a Chinese hoax still, right? Like literally, I think he still says that. Yeah.
The China virus. Oh my God.
Haitian migrants eating cats, whatever.
It's
been my thing. That's been my thing this week, right?
Yeah.
But so I mean, I guess that's one difference. But I mean, there's within the climate community, there's what they call climate hawks, and there's what they call climate neoliberals. And so there's people who actually want to make money off of the climate crisis, right? They want to make carbon markets. They want to, create new technologies which are going to solve the climate crisis, but it's going to make a lot of money for, investors and
Yeah.
industry and things like that. And so they may acknowledge that the climate crisis is real, but then they're also thinking about how to cash in on it.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
but then there's climate hawks who actually want the government to regulate carbon emissions and things like that. But,
Yeah. It gives me like the
and that's the climate movement that I'm a part of
Okay.
more than anything else.
yeah.
But the climate neoliberals are who we should really be afraid of. And that's also people within the environmental nonprofit complex too. Like there's a lot of the big greens which actually push some of those ideas about like market, carbon markets and things like that. So it's not just industry.
Sarah Club put out a statement this morning just gushing about Kamala Harris.
I'm sure.
Oh my God.
Well, I mean, even the progressive climate groups are lining up behind Kamala Harris. I mean, it's not too surprising because everyone's so terrified of Trump, but still, like, even the more center left groups have been coming out in support of Harris.
Yeah, there's still like the whole rhetoric of, if we just keep the markets open, we can do this with the markets. Shell itself has been reinvesting money into clean energy, but the whole point is, as long as they can make the money, they don't care if oil's gone, as long as who is producing the majority of energy is them, those corporations. And I guess that's the only way to like push people to go into clean energy, but still somehow have a capitalist market. I don't know who they're trying to entice, but it is kind of sad.
What is that one billionaire's name? Leo Leonard? Is that his name?
Leonard Leo.
Leonard Leo, who wants to raise $1 billion for Trump from oil and gas. I mean, I'm sure that's part of why, and Trump, there's actually a pretty serious lawsuit against Greenpeace right now, in a North Dakota court from a oil and gas company called Energy Transfer Partners, and the former CEO is a billionaire named Kelsey Warren, who's actually gave a lot of money to Trump in 2016 and 2020, and I'm sure 2024, and they want to destroy green groups, big groups, small groups, whatever. And so I'm sure that's why all those green groups are lining up behind Harris. I mean, Trump is. They talk about climate change as an existential threat to, the planet. The green groups see Trump as an existential threat to them. So it makes sense.
Yeah. One group doesn't even acknowledge, and the other group acknowledges it, but does such short incremental changes that it won't do anything.
I would actually say that what Trump wants to do is he will try to destroy those groups too. So what's happening with Greenpeace and Energy Transfer Partners is like, I think what Trump would do to a lot of environment groups, like figure out ways to put them out of business.
And, and last night Harris was boasting about oil production being at record highs and, defending fracking, which even a majority of Pennsylvanians don't support, right?
Right.
I mean, I think it's simple to say that Democrats and Republicans are exactly alike, but at the same time, the differences aren't that great. And then you have, people who we actually looked up to, like the Squad, many members of the Squad who are now, pretty much indistinguishable from Pelosi and Schumer Democrats. Or
voted out of office.
Or voted out of office, attacked. And so we've got a lot of work to do, obviously.
Yeah, but you have to keep pushing regardless if there is no progress. It'd be a shame to just go down without a fight. Oh, I have a question for you, Bob. So did you ever receive any backlash from like the universities you taught at, or like other professors, other faculty members for your views?
Yeah.
All of the above.
Yeah, more than once. It could be very hairy. I mean, I've tried to organize people on campus in a union. I've been active in campus politics, and these so-called liberals at the university can be vicious. The biggest was it kind of appropriate and ironic in 2002. I had a radio show at the time on Pacifica, which is supposed to be a lefty network, and I got attacked by the Pacifica network for criticizing Israel, which is like crazy, right? But this was when Israel was blowing up Jenin, which is doing again today. I said it was a terrorist government, the Zionists went after me like harshly, and like sent emails to the University of Houston, to the dean, the provost, my chair, and all this stuff, and nothing substantial came of it, but it was a lousy thing to have to go through. So yeah, and as we've seen, as we saw last spring with the campus protest about Gaza, I mean, universities are not friendly places to protest or to progressive ideas or to diversity or even free speech. And I learned that lesson, unfortunately, a long time ago. So yeah, there clearly are consequences. And people like Greg Abbott in Texas, where I teach, I think it's only a matter of time. Well, they did. They fired professors at community colleges recently. They fired quite a few.
Wow.
And it's only a matter of time. They're trying to get rid of tenure, which several southern states have been trying to do. And I'm older, so I'm not going to be around that much longer. But there are definitely younger professors are going to be in the crosshairs. Absolutely.
Yeah, because that reminds me, we just finished. So our most previous episode that we put up was basically us reading the book from Michael Parenti, Black Shirts and Reds, and analyzing it. And he was also a professor that fought against the war in Vietnam, and he got arrested at one point, and he got kicked out of any sort of being a professor, like any sort of teaching profession. So he became a writer. So I was just wondering, like, how do you handle like those situations? You kind of have to like watch your mouth at certain points. Why him and not you?
Yeah, I don't know. I never did. I mean, luckily this was 20 years ago, and things weren't as intense as like Vietnam, or they are now. Because in that era, you had like famous scholars, not just Mike Parenti, but Bruce Franklin lost a job, very well-known lefty scholar, died last year. Stott Lynn, brilliant scholar, died a couple years ago. Just an amazing, brilliant guy, lost a job at Yale for going to Vietnam with Tom Hayden. So it's not at all unusual, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it. I don't know. I was kind of lucky. I didn't back down. I was, kind of defiant about it. Kind of said, "Bring it on." I'm tenured. That was the biggest thing. If I weren't tenured, I'd been gone. So, but it wasn't fun, and I just think it's going to get worse. And the worst part is that we hear all this stuff about radical professors and the Marxists in the university and blah blah blah. When you go through this, and anybody who's gone through it will tell you the exact same story. Your colleagues don't have your back. People who call themselves radical, they boast about doing labor history or women's history, African American history, or whatever. But when the rubber meets the road and it's a real life situation, they won't have your back.
Oh yeah.
And we saw. I mean, one of the cool things in the spring was that a lot of faculty were coming out to defend the kids, to support the kids, but a lot weren't, and that's troublesome.
Yeah. Well, hopefully there's like an overwhelming amount of future professors and faculty members that are like, for example, pro-Palestine or just lefty in general, where they can't fire us all, as they say. You can't take us all.
I think. I mean, professors in general are liberal or to the left. Most are, absolutely. That stereotype's correct, but even then, I just think they're intimidated, and a lot of them are just like, it's hard to find a job as a professor. Everybody's using adjuncts and part-timers. So if you get a tenure-line job, I think people are going to be more than ever going to be inclined to just, lay low, be quiet, don't cause any trouble. I've talked to people like professors who would don't want to wear rainbow-colored shoes because they might get in trouble for it because, it's the LGBTQ flag or something like that. So it's not the bravest, a group of people you've ever encountered. So I hope that, you're right. They can't fire all of us. And that's a point I've been trying to make for years. But I think some of them, they don't think that way. It's not like they can't fire all of us. It's just they might fire me and not take, and, which is legit, But I've seen this like intense attack on public education and higher education in America for many years now, and especially being in Texas, which in some ways is ground zero for it. And it's fairly frightening, fairly chilling.
Well, I want to flip this 180 degrees to you, Scott. I was actually thinking about this earlier. What do you think about like nuclear energy? Because I know some people are very against it, some people are for it. I just wanted to hear your perspective.
Yeah, we've done actually a number of shows on this, and I mean, very much fall into a anti-nuclear school of thought. I mean, a lot of people who actually taught me organizing. Actually, we're out of this really awesome organizing school called the Anti-Nuclear Movement, which actually did a lot of really powerful organizing in the 70s and 80s and beyond. But the sort of narrative that I actually feel like is being put out by the nuclear industry, but it's kind of spread into like lefty socialist media, is that nuclear is a solution to climate change. But I also have organized a lot with what I call the climate justice movement, which are communities which live on the front line of extraction, or they live on the front line of like plants and coal plants and oil refineries, but also nuclear plants. And the nuclear is not clean. It's it doesn't actually have it has some level of a carbon footprint. But there's also just this terrible history of like uranium extraction on native land and in the Four Corners, for example, or native land in Australia or in Northern Ontario. And then also the kind of one of the bigger things is that there's just a huge amount of waste that comes from it that doesn't go away. And so it's not really a viable solution to climate, like the industry is trying to make an argument for, or like our some of our media competitors at Jacobin actually like to make a case for that. We actually talk about this quite a bit, and actually talk about, particularly at Jacobin, they're very pro-nuclear, for example. But I would say Bob falls in this category too, are very anti-nuclear.
Fair enough. Jacobin, I don't know. They always seem a little bit like of sock dems to me. They're not real like anti-capitalists. Yeah, they're leftists, but it's when shit goes down, they will fall in line to the Democrats. They will most likely end up saying, "Oh, you should vote for Kamala. This is the most important election of our lifetime." Blah blah blah. I've heard it every 4 years. So yeah, I've honestly not. We don't talk too much on the environmental issues as we should, and so that's why you're basically an expert on this. That'd be real. Wanted to hear your point of view.
I never want to call myself an expert on anything.
I'll call you an expert. You don't have to call yourself an when you've been reading about and organizing around that sort of stuff for 20-25 years. I mean, you don't need a degree. You've learned on the field.
Yeah.
At least that's the way I think about it. A lot of it's just experience, and you could read the books yourself at the end of the day. Everything that you read in a university is also available online. It's just how does somebody explain it to you?
I will throw out, especially for people who are listening, if you want to know more about the anti-nuclear perspective, especially around climate change, 2 good books to read. One is Nuclear is Not the Solution by M.V. Ramana. We actually just had him on our show in July. And then also highly recommend that book. You can also watch our episode. And then I would also say this is less about nukes, but it's less about climate change, but it is about the impact of nuclear waste, which is a book called Atomic Days by the journalist and editor at Counterpunch, Joshua Frank, who's a good friend of our podcast. And Joshua actually talks about Hanford, Washington, which is not too far from you, which is a huge nuclear waste dump where they actually used to develop nuclear weapons, but it also sits on the Columbia River. And there's actually there's a great potential that the nuclear waste could start leaking into the Columbia River and just poison everything downstream from that, which includes Portland, Oregon. And so highly recommend Nuclear is Not the Solution and Atomic Days. And also Josh and Ramana are on like lots of podcasts these days too.
Yeah, send me a link.
Josh actually hosts the Counterpunch.
Ooh, yeah, send me a link to that episode, and I could link it down below if anybody wants to go check it out.
Yeah, totally.
All right.
And like we get into arguments. Some people would call them debates. I would call them arguments with a lot of the sort of like pro-nuclear people on the left, particularly so-called socialists and Jacobin, people.
With me, it's just trolling.
Yeah, Bob trolls. I mostly name call. I guess that's the same thing.
I guess it tend to pass. Trolling is basically just like passive aggressive name calling.
I'm pretty aggressive. I'm not really.
That's the way we like them. I mean, from another perspective, then what would you say would be like an ideal, or not even ideal country, but like a another system, another country that has a better clean energy program that we could look at for the future, perhaps maybe imitate a little bit of? Would you say China is that? Would you say Australia, New Zealand?
Um, I mean, there's like some like Northern European countries I actually think have some pretty good clean energy programs. Not countries like France or the UK, but Scandinavian countries, things like that. I mean, China is a little bit of above all of the above. I mean, they still import a lot of coal, and Australia actually is one of the bigger coal exporters in the world, and they ship a lot of that to East Asia, to like China and Japan, or at least Japan and other parts of Asia. But Northern European countries, that sort of thing. I mean, no government is actually going to have a really great kind of clean energy program. A lot of them talk about it. Some of them are making the transition, but a lot of them are still like locked into fossil fuels. And I mean, I think that's an important thing to note, is that fossil fuels has just been such a dominant part of like how our economy works and how governments work and how states are run, is that like it's going to take a long time to get us off of them. The scary part is that we don't have that much time to get off of them. And then fossil fuels do a pretty good job of lobbying to keep themselves in business too. So there's
that was actually going to be my next question to you. Do you think we have already passed that point of no return? Is that like, what is that year 2030 that they keep saying is like, if we don't really change, have like drastic measures by then, we're kind of fucked, I guess.
50% reduction by 2020. In the 2000s when I was campaigning, that was the goal, right? A 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2020. So we're past that, and we're kind of screwed on that. I mean, I, like Bob, try to remain hopeful, but with some of what we're beginning to see as far as like the climate unraveling is pretty scary. And at this point, we need to talk about mitigation, and we need to talk about what they call climate resilience, and so how we can better take care of ourselves as these disasters are unfolding. Like, you and I live on the West Coast, and I think there's something like 70 or 80 fires burning in Western North America right now, right? Some are not too far from where I am right now. And so we need to actually talk a lot more about climate resilience, and there's a Category 5 storm hitting Louisiana right now, right?
It's not Cat 5, but it hit. It was about 100 miles an hour when it hit.
Jesus.
Yeah.
But
so
it actually, luckily, skirted away from Houston. I feel bad for the people in Louisiana, but it skirted away from us, Texas. But we've got more extreme storms in the last 4 or 5 years than like my entire time here before that.
Yeah.
We just there's flooding and storms like, those so-called 100-year storms or 1,000-year storms that were supposed to occur every century, every millennium, now occur at least every year or more.
I would actually say as a society, or as a country, the U.S. is very unprepared for climate resilience. Even if you look at cities like Houston or other cities along the Gulf Coast, is that when these storms hit, they're completely unprepared to be able to deal with this sort of thing. And these are not states which are investing a lot in infrastructure. And so whether it's a hurricane, or whether Texas freeze, which I think it happened in 2021, that had a power outage through a lot of the state during like a terrible cold spell. It's like we as a country need to think about climate resilience. I would also say that activists need to think about how to be more involved in their communities for climate resilience as well. There's a great group I've worked with called Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, which actually came out with people who did a bunch of disaster relief out of Katrina, which have been organizing around that. So when you see wildfires or storms or anything like that, it's sort of an anarchist anti-authoritarian effort to like provide mutual aid and disaster support, or disaster relief.
Yeah, we always say here that like voting really doesn't do much, if it does anything at all. And the best thing they could do is some sort of mutual aid and physically getting out there and helping out. Because it's kind of a free for all out there. But speaking of the Texas freeze, it just reminded me of Ted Cruz and how we ended up going to Cancun while the whole thing was going down, and I just thought that was like such a bad look. How was that, experiencing that in Texas at that time? Were you in Texas at that time?
Luckily that week I was not. That was right after COVID, so we were still on like lockdown. So I was out. But
Yeah.
I remember well, and everybody I know went through it, right? And I mean, that happens like every time, like if the temperature hits 100, I get emails all day saying they're going to be rolling blackouts and conserve your power. Like a lot of older people especially died after Burrow because there wasn't any electricity for in some places 2, 3 weeks. People couldn't use air conditioning. Air conditioning in Houston in the summer, can't live without it. And so, and I think, and I don't know if like I say we kind of collectively need to do a better job. I think people don't understand like the global warming isn't this kind of ethereal, distant thing. It's real. Like in these superstorms and these fires, or I read a story today. Unfortunately, I forgot the details about agriculture being hit. Like crops are being ruined, so we're going to see, a short food supply, higher prices, and so forth. Like this is all conditioned by this massive global crisis, this climate crisis, and people are just kind of whistling past the graveyard, and you're tree huggers, or they see an iceberg melting, and I think they think it's very distant, but the reality is it's at our doorstep. And if you live in a place like Houston or where you guys live, it's even more alarming because we see it, in various ways far more frequently. Like in Ohio, weather's great. It's become like it'll probably be a tourist destination in 30 or 40 years because half the country will be underwater. But here in Houston, I mean, yeah, it's just, and people freak out. It creates anxiety, it creates health issues. And when storms do hit Texas, there's no regulation here. And there are like hundreds and hundreds of chemical and petroleum plants on the coast that just get slaughtered. They get slammed. And, in some cases, you don't even know what's there. You don't even know what's been, released into the water because there's really no regulation here in Texas. There's no reporting. There's no inspections. So it affects our lives. Like the water you drink is probably.
And not only that, but you have that whole grid that's technically, doesn't Texas have like the only electric grid that is not based on like a federal like grid where you're sharing energy?
Right.
What's up with that? Like why, I mean, what is there like some sort of grid?
So, well, that happened in 2021 during the freezes and in other times too. So if there's a crisis, like if you're on the grid, the national grid, you can get energy from another state. You could go to Oklahoma or Louisiana or wherever. Texas has its own grid. So it's really isolated that way. And this is part of the whole, like let's secede and we're Texas and we're the Lone Star State and all this shit. And it's really, terrifying. And you have, these elected officials in Texas will come right out and say like old people would rather die than not be energy independent. I mean, they say that like, I don't know. Cruz and all of them, Abbott,
Dan Patrick said that.
Old people would rather die than give up their energy independence and shit. I don't think he interviewed any old people before he said that, but it really controls the entire state.
Yeah. He said, I think part of it was he said that old people would rather die than sacrifice their children's economic futures.
Yeah, but it was, well, they said the same thing during COVID, right?
Yeah.
Hey, old people are going to have to die. What are you going to do? Well, it's like J.D. Vance say, school shootings are just like inevitable,
Fact of life.
Fact of life. As he stands behind a big plexiglass shelter.
Yeah, I wonder if that would be a really good video idea to go out there and, in moments like that where statements are made by senators and go directly ask those, senior people if they're willing to risk their life for energy independence.
Yeah. Really, for the ruling class is what they're sacrificing for.
Yeah, of course. At the end of the day, it's all about, how they're going to make their buck. But for me, it's like, it's just like ego lifting from like the Texas government to not like attach their grid to the rest of the federal grid, or is there like some sort of like company that is really profiting off of that isolated grid?
Texas has the energy. It's called ERCOT. I forget what it stands for. The Energy so-called Regulatory Agency. Here in Texas, because it's individual, it creates its own market, and so the oil companies have daily market rates. So like in 2021, I wasn't even here. I was out of town when the freeze hit. I got a $900 electric bill, and I wasn't here. My electricity wasn't, my heater, nothing was on. And I got a $900 bill because they changed the rates daily. So if there's a freeze or if the temperature is going to be 110, they'll jack the rates up. In some cases, it could be tenfold or more than that for that day. So, this is all like the oil company owns this state.
Yeah.
I've never seen a capture of the political process, anything like as total and complete as what the oil companies in Texas have done. It's their state. They own it. And they've convinced a hell of a lot of people that it works for them as well, which is the hard
That
part, right?
that same company I was talking about that is suing Greenpeace and was actually the company that built the Dakota Access Pipeline. The Energy Transfer Partners is one of the main companies. I actually think Energy Transfer Partners actually sued Beto O'Rourke because when he was running for governor in 2022, he was criticizing them over the Texas freeze and over their undue influence over ERCOT and other government agencies.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I didn't even realize that the entire grid was basically controlled by those energy companies as well.
Yeah.
And then they're changing rates like daily like that. I mean,
Yeah. Jerry Jones, the guy who owns the Cowboys, in February of 2021, what did he make? Like $1 billion, like in just that week or that day, I forget, in a couple days. He made like $1 billion because he was able to just, it's a captive market. And it didn't even work. I mean, we saw, I don't know, you probably remember seeing these images of power plants that were literally frozen over. They were like icicles hanging from them. They didn't even have heat in these places. So like the whole grid froze over. The only thing that continued to work were the wind and solar energy panels. Right? Those didn't go down, but all the fossil fuels did.
We did a show on this at the time. Is what the right did at the time, as people were literally freezing to death in Texas, is the right actually went on the offensive around the Green New Deal and around wind and solar on like Fox News and things like that. Just dispelling the notion that wind and solar were actually the only thing working at the time.
Yeah,
I believe there was I mean, we're not a big fan, but I'm not a big fan, but like there was a big attack on AOC and the Green New Deal at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the time AOC was kind of like a radical figure, and she wasn't as kissy kissy to Nancy Pelosi as she is now, unfortunately. But when you hang out with so many neoliberals all day, you kind of turn into one. That's what politics and government will do to you.
We did a whole series on the Texas freeze on our podcast.
Nice. I can link that one as well if you want to send me the video.
Yeah.
But yeah, now AOC is basically just a cheerleader for the Democratic Party, and it's sad because I back a while ago I used to be a very big fan, and I'm still a fairly big fan of Kyle Kalinske from Secular Talk, and he was basically one of the people that started the movement of like where the organization called Justice Democrats, and he would so him and I can't remember 3 other people, but AOC was one of those people where they scouted to push these progressive policies into the Democratic Party, basically trying to overturn the Democratic Party into like a progressive Socdem party.
Yeah.
Well, we see how well that worked. So at this point, if some kind of green energy policy is not being pushed by a socialist or an anarchist of some sort, an anti-capitalist, like an actual anti-capitalist, I don't believe a word that they're saying, because every single word that they say is basically backtrack 4 years later or 3 years later. It doesn't make sense to be hopeful, in my opinion, from like the Democratic side.
And AOC, she's gotten a lot of people involved in politics, which is good, but yeah, I mean, what her evolution isn't that shocking. I mean, you'll see that frequently, because I suspect she probably wants to become Senator AOC at some point, or Governor AOC, or who knows, and you have to play ball within the Democratic Party to do that. Look what happened to Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman. So it's just a difficult system. The squad itself, would it have 6 people, 8 people in it, who are like associated?
That, yeah.
We have one senator, Bernie Sanders, although actually I think, I spent a lot of time in Ohio. Sherrod Brown is maybe the best senator, in the Democratic Party, but there's just so few, for every Sherrod Brown or Bernie Sanders, you've got Joe Manchin, and you've got all these crazy Republicans, and Ted Cruz, and Mitch McConnell, and Kristen Sinema, and all this. So it's just such an uphill climb in the political process, which is why, a point you made earlier, which I think really is important, and something we talk about all the time, which is that instead of like being obsessed with this electoral process, we need to organize, whether that be mutual aid or whether it be unions or, environmental resistance, whatever. Organization at this point is, I think, in the long term, just really exponentially more effective than getting all geared up to vote every 4 years for somebody that you have no role in choosing. Like, we didn't pick Biden, we didn't pick Trump, we didn't pick Harris, we didn't pick any of these people, right? They're just like there.
Yeah. So as as politics are ruling by, do you see like any actual a substantial effort of like going into the Democratic Party, changing the party, or are you more of like in line of like starting a third party and totally just throwing the Democratic Party out? Because the Democratic Party at this point are center right. They're really getting out there, and there's no actual left party. And so to bring them back to the left, this huge window that we have where Bernie Sanders, who's a social democrat, is considered radical left. What must be done to the Democratic Party? Do we just throw that whole idea of like of using them as like some sort of boat to push for the left, or do we start a new party, or do we push for an existing party that exists right now, like the Green Party or PSL?
This is something we talk about a lot too. I think the Democrats forget it. You're not reaching them. We've studied this a lot, and I've thought about it. From 1968 or 1972, pick whichever you want. Democratic Party has been moving steadily and fairly abruptly to the right. Every time the Republicans move to the right or accuse the Democrats of being liberals or socialists or communists or Marx, whatever, the Democrats even move further to the right. So the idea of getting through, right now, the Democrats are far more interested in embracing Dick Cheney and Lynn Cheney and all these people. And when Cori Bush was defeated by AIPAC and pointed that out, the White House condemned her for invoking AIPAC. So, I think the idea of going through the Democratic is kind of futile. Third parties, it's a nice idea, but again, it requires so much time and energy and focus, and the rules really are rigged. So that's why, I think if people want to vote, that's fine. That's a tactic. Great, go for it. But to me, just moving out of that electoral mindset into creating these kind of community organizations, unions, environmental resistance groups, whatever. There's a ton of things I would rather see that done to create a base. It's a slow process. It's not going to happen tomorrow. But working with the Democrats or trying to create a third party or join a third party, to me, is just such a massive uphill Sisyphean climb.
Yeah. My concern is do we have enough time to change anything because it takes, like you said, it takes a long time to build something that's grassroots, and by the time you actually get to become a large party, there's probably so much change and corruption within the party. But at what point do you all right, just bring out the arms?
Well, and things can happen quick. Look at the summer of 2020. That was all spontaneous.
Yeah, that was.
And much of it was inspirational, and to some degree, in some places, they kind of created some reforms for the police forces, and Black Lives Matter was taken more seriously for a bit. So, but it's hard to kind of keep counting on crises in order to create a spontaneous resistance to them. You can't operate that way either.
I would also say is that one of the things we talk about on our show is all the different crises that are happening. So climate crises, there's a increasing economic gap between rich and poor. There's a political crisis, particularly around the rise of the far right in the climate and everything else. And so, what's going to be important is going to be building up your community organization, building up within your union, getting involved, building up a group with your comrades and things like that, and making sure it's sustainable. Like what I was talking about before with climate resilience. That needs to happen locally, right? And so same with some of the mutual aid, all of these different things. Part of this is I come out of anarchist tradition, and it's we need to be sort of doing base building and organizing and political education. And, basically I did it too last night. It's we're just watching debates between one lunatic and one corporate hack, right? And that's what we're spending all of our time on. And just think about how much money they're also spending on this election cycle. A fraction of that, we could build up some pretty substantial sort of people movements, people organizations, and not the Democratic Party. And then, the other thing I would say here is that the more liberal side of the sort of system right now is really using fascism they're really fear-mongering with fascism. And I'm scared of Trump and things like that, but I feel that's just what they're throwing out all the time, to the point where that word is beginning to have less and less meaning to me. And I've I live in the Bay Area, and we have real fascists come protest here from time to time, and I've been out and mix up with them. And I was like, but like, we need to like be careful about how we're like identifying that too. But building up a base with your comrades and building up a community organization, I think is the important thing to do here.
Well, you mentioned Bernie Sanders a couple times. In 2020, Bernie Sanders raised $180 million in like about a month or two, which at the time, like I think he was a leading fundraiser, right? And I actually don't have any issue with money. It's as good as you're going to get, right? But Bernie Sanders was never going to be president. We saw that in 2016, right? Yet, he had $180 million. And for a time when we would do interviews, especially of activists, I would say, like, what could you do with $1.8 million, right? And all of them said, oh my God, I could do this, this, and this, right? And so, that $180 million went to Bernie Sanders. People invested so much time volunteering, traveling to Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada and places like that to campaign for him. At the end of the day, it was such a Pyrrhic, victory, the fact that he did well. And it was really, in many ways, just a futile campaign. Bernie Sanders was never going to be the candidate, never will be. It's ironic, isn't it? The Republican Party had a far more small d democratic process. They hated Trump, but he won the vote and they let him win it. Whereas the Democrats would not do that for Sanders, right? So that's the scary part. The Republican Party was actually more open to somebody who was challenging them than the Democrats would ever be. And that's frightening. And I'm old enough to remember the Jesse Jackson campaign, and Jerry Brown ran, and Tom Harkin, and all these people who were like supposed to be like, kind of reformed lefties. And the Democrats crushed every one of them. And one more thing, I'm sorry, but I think this is important, because we talked about third parties. Another problem there is that when you lose, and you will, you're going to get blamed. And one of the biggest things I've said since Ralph Nader in 2000 is, if you're going to run and the Democrats blame you, then you should embrace that. Instead of saying, no, we didn't defeat you. It was this and this and this. To me, what Nader should have said, and what other people, or Jill Stein, whoever should say, is, you're damn right we beat you. You lost because of us. And we'll continue, and it'll continue that way unless you start listening to what these people want, right?
Exactly.
Because look at the right wing of the Republican Party. They're insane. That's the most extremist group of people in American political history. They're nuts. I mean, it's 1824 in a lot of ways, right? But they don't back down, and the Republican Party embraces the craziest shit you can come up with. Whereas the Democrats just punch left all the time. They'd rather have Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney on their side than let a Palestinian American speak at the convention, or reach out, or make some kind of accommodations on health issues or health care, Medicare, or anything. So it's a right-wing party. That's the problem we have. So it's a far right-wing party.
Well, yeah, you get a right-wing party and a far right-wing party.
Yeah.
They're all corporate hacks. One's led by a lunatic, the other one's led by a laughing psychopath, I guess. Well, I really appreciate you guys for coming on. It was a pleasure meeting both of you. We'd love to have you on together again, especially when my co-host is available. He's also
It's a good chat.
a teacher of history, so
Cool.
yeah, I figured you guys get along very well.
Great. Yeah.
Let everybody know where they can find you.
You can check us out at greenandredpodcast.org. We're also on all the socials: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're on YouTube, and then we're on about a dozen different audio podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple and Google and Podbean and things like that.
Yeah, I see you guys are killing.
And we're also on Patreon. And we're also, one other thing, I'm going to pitch this one. We're also on Patreon, so check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/Green Red Podcast and become a patron.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys for coming on. We'll hope to have you on again soon.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you
great
so
chat.
much.
Great chat. That was a great chat.
Cool.
Yeah, it
Thank
really
you.
was. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Of course, thank you.